Good day. Today is Monday, 29th December 2025, and as you can obviously hear from my voice, I still have problems with my voice, and I'm afraid that definitely does mean that today's program is going to be a lot shorter than usual. Nonetheless, at this point, can I just say that, can I again remind you, if once you've watched this shorter video with its slightly croaky voice, but if you watched it and liked the video, please do remember to tick the like button. Now, before I proceed with the substance of today's program, I feel I need to give an apology for some of the information that I published in my previous video, the one I published on Friday, or rather on Saturday, before my voice entirely went. Over the course of that video, when discussing various court cases that the Russians are bringing around the world in connection with the freezing of their assets, I relied heavily and I quoted extensively from a video which I believed in complete good faith to have been made by Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister. The reliance upon that video, by the way, is an object lesson in the dangers of trying to do videos as complex and as detailed as the one I did on Saturday whilst feeling ill. If I'd not been running a temperature and had been more alert to the background of that video, I probably would have noticed that it was clearly an AI-generated fake, and of course I'd have done more extensive background checks than I was able to do. Nonetheless, one should not make excuses. It was my mistake, and I must apologize, as I said, for my over-reliance on that video, my excessive reliance upon that video, and I should apologize to everybody who watched that program and perhaps was led astray by me, as I said, inadvertently, over the course of that program through my reliance on that video. And of course, the other person I do need to apologize to is Yanis Varoufakis himself, if of course he's even aware of the fact that I made this program. Now, I'm going to just make one very quick observation before I move on, because obviously I'm not going to spend a great deal of time. This is that YouTube is now filling up with videos of this kind. My avatar, the AI image of myself is still out there, and more of these videos are proliferating. It is hard enough already to try to distinguish real news from fake news at this particular time, and this existence of these fake videos, which can be sometimes quite effective impersonations, adds just another further layer of complexity. I know that YouTube takes pride, as they say, in protecting the integrity of the platform. I am surprised that they have not taken action to bring all of these videos to a stop, and I strongly urge them to do so. All of these AI fakes to stop, and I strongly urge them to do so. That does not, of course, excuse my own error, for which, as I said, I hope I have clearly apologized. Now, let's proceed with the program, today's program. And, well, a lot of things have happened since I last did a program. We've had the meeting in Florida between Trump and Zelensky. We've had an important telephone call between Putin and Trump, which immediately preceded that program, that meeting, sorry. We've also had a meeting between Putin and his generals, in which they informed him of really very dramatic events on the battle lines. And as I am making this program, another important meeting between Putin and his generals is underway. So this has been, the last couple of days have actually been packed with news. But I'm going to here make a general observation, which is that my overall sense is that in this conflict in Ukraine, the West collectively, both the Europeans and the Americans, have now reached their limits. They provided Ukraine with hundreds upon hundreds of billions of dollars in financial assistance. They've given Ukraine a very significant part of their military arsenals. They've sanctioned Russia in ways that have done significant damage to their own economies, and this is especially true of the Europeans themselves. And what they have found is that despite all of that, despite throwing everything that they could at the Russians and into supporting Ukraine, the war continues to go in Russia's favor, and the momentum of the Russian advances is now accelerating. And it has become increasingly difficult for even the hardliners in the West to deny this truth. They might cling on from time to time to straws of comfort. They might tell themselves that the Russians are practically exhausted, that they're suffering massive losses, that Kupiansk is on the brink of being recaptured by the Ukrainians. But I am starting to sense an increasing lack of conviction. And this is what played out, in my opinion, very much in Florida yesterday. So Zelensky came along. He'd previously rejected Trump's 28-point proposals, the 28-point proposals put together by Trump's team, by Witkoff and Kushner. Proposals which, to be very clear, the Russians have not accepted, but which do nonetheless make some movement towards Russian positions. So Zelensky rejected that proposal. The Europeans supported him in rejecting that proposal with the help of the Europeans, and there's no doubt that the Europeans have been heavily involved. Just before Zelensky met with Trump in Florida, just a few minutes before, Zelensky had a lengthy conversation with his dear friend, Prime Minister Keir Starmer of Britain, who always remains far more interested in the affairs of Ukraine than he is, as far as I can tell, in the worsening affairs of his own country, my country, Britain. But anyway, the Europeans, as I said, were clearly involved in putting together Zelensky's plan, and this time it is a Zelensky plan, the 20 points that Zelensky has been talking about. As I've discussed in various programs, the 20-point plan that Zelensky is proposing is essentially the same proposal, repackaged, that he's been coming up with throughout the entire year. A freeze on the existing conflict lines. He dresses this up in all kinds of ways. He says either there's going to be a simple ceasefire on the existing conflict lines, or the Russians withdraw from the conflict lines and Ukraine withdraws from the conflict lines, at which point, of course, some kind of free trade zone will be established over the remaining contested areas of Donbass. But of course, always on the proviso that these territories remain administratively part of Ukraine, a proposal which the Russians were never going to accept. So proposals like that, proposals for a 60-day ceasefire so that the Ukrainians could conduct some kind of referendum Very difficult to understand what the purpose of that referendum would be, but apparently to endorse or reject Zelensky's peace proposals or any counter proposals that the Americans might make. That referendum, by the way, hedged around with conditions over the course of a press conference which took place in Trump's presence after that meeting. Zelensky, for example, evaded all discussions about including Ukrainians on Russian territory, allowing them to participate in the referendum. Following the pattern already established in Moldova during the recent elections there, Ukrainians in Europe will be able to vote, but Ukrainians in Russia presumably will not be. Anyway, a 60-day ceasefire to enable this mysterious, unexplained referendum to take place. A 60-day ceasefire being, of course, a ceasefire. So it's another way of getting a ceasefire. An 800,000-man Ukrainian army, which even the Ukrainians themselves admit they cannot afford and cannot sustain in any kind of peacetime conditions, but which the Russians would reject unequivocally. And, well, other similarly far-fetched proposals. Zelensky is saying that Ukraine should be given security guarantees by the United States, which will be ratified by the Senate. I've already discussed how that would be, in effect, a treaty of alliance. He says, and we only have his word for it, by the way, that the Americans have agreed to provide these guarantees, but only for 15 years. 15 years? That doesn't sound very temporary or short-term to me. A 15-year guarantee of the kind that Zelensky's talking about would be nothing like temporary. I mean, it would be essentially a permanent arrangement. And one can very easily imagine how at the end of that 15 years, the next step would be bringing Ukraine into NATO, assuming, of course, that it was not already in NATO long before then. But then Zelensky comes out and says that even these 15-year guarantee is not enough. He needs a 50-year guarantee. A 50-year guarantee, security guarantee, a military alliance for the United States lasting for 50 years. And, well, Alex and I on the Duran, and I myself on this channel, have pointed out multiple times in many places that the 90 billion euro loan that the Europeans were offering, are going to give to Ukraine, goes nowhere near enough. There's a Substack blog, by the way, which I've recently discovered, published by somebody called Americanets, who calls himself Americanets, which goes into the details of this loan. And, by the way, assumes that the Ukrainians are going to get the entire 90 billion euros and that the 45 billion euro loan given to Ukraine by the G7 is going to continue to be rolled over, which means, incidentally, that the Europeans are paying interest on that loan still, and that's said to amount to 3 billion euros. The 3 billion euros each year. The interest on the 90 billion euro loan is going to be much greater than this, and as these are going to be bonds floated in international markets, as I've discussed in many programs already, the interest on this loan is going to be multiples higher than this. I personally would not be surprised if the Europeans were paying in interest terms well in excess of 10 billion euros in interest, and even the 3 billion in interest that they're paying now is certainly not covered by the funds, the frozen Russian assets, the interest generated by the frozen Russian assets held by Euroclear, as the Europeans are claiming. Anyway, let's not dwell on to all that now. The point is that Zelensky is already saying that the 90 billion euros is nowhere near enough. He needs more. He needs much, much more, he says. He says that's not enough. 90 billion is not enough to build the drones or buy the air defense missile interceptors or do all of these things. So just a week after the Europeans are giving him, I've said that they're going to give him, through this bond issue, a 90 billion euro loan. Surprise, surprise, Zelensky comes back for more. And he will always come back for more, however much money he is given, just to say. Anyway, despite all of that, despite all of these demands, despite the Europeans joining in all of these demands, the major difference this time is firstly that the Americans, Trump himself, showed no signs this time of being willing to accede to any one of these demands. And the Europeans, for their part, seem to lack the fervour and the energy that they showed back in August when they pushed back very hard against the tentative steps that Trump was taking at that time, following Trump's meeting with Putin in Anchorage, to start to shift slowly towards the Russian position. This time, the Europeans have been largely silent. According to the German media, there is an ongoing row underway between Merz, the German Chancellor, and French President Macron. Macron is saying that, we are basically played out. We need to start to talk to Putin. We don't really have any choice. A failure to speak to Putin would be increasingly dangerous. Merz, furious with Macron because he didn't back Merz's plan to misappropriate the Russian assets. Merz also far more obsessive, or perhaps even more obsessive, about the Russians than Macron is, and still determined to wage war, to wage war via the Ukrainians against the Russians for as long as possible, and even beyond that. Merz refusing any suggestion of negotiations with the Russians at this time. So you can see that there's dissension, there's argument in Europe about the situation. The Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, has warned the officials of the Italian government, the entire bureaucracy, that if they think that 2025 was bad, she has news for them. 2026 is going to be much more difficult. It's going to be far worse. So the Europeans no longer showing the same fervour and energy in pushing back against Trump's diplomatic initiatives, as was the case back in August after the Anchorage meeting. And in America, in the United States itself, I also get the sense that some of the energy that used to come from the neocons and the hardliners in Washington has also dissipated. Trump meets Zelensky. He doesn't seem to be under the same kind of pressure as before. Lindsey Graham is not turning up everywhere all the time, demanding more escalation and demanding more massive tariffs against people who buy Russian oil and all of those things. I'm not saying he's not saying these things, and he's not saying them when he's asked, but somehow I feel that there seems to be less of Lindsey Graham at the moment, and he doesn't seem to be saying things with the same kind of conviction. And there doesn't seem to be the same energy in Congress, the same push to keep supporting Zelensky in even his most extravagant demands, such as we saw back in August. So this time, whereas after the Anchorage meeting, Trump retreated, he agreed eventually to go back to the unconditional ceasefire idea on the existing front lines. He imposed sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil, the Russian oil companies. He spread stories that he'd had a telephone call with Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, over the course of which Modi told him that India would stop buying Russian oil by the end of this year. That, by the way, that is absolutely untrue. India continues to buy Russian oil. And again, exactly as I said on this channel, many times in fact, and exactly as we said on the Duran, Alex and I, not only are the Indians continuing to buy Russian oil, but there is confirmation that Reliance, the big Indian oil refiner, which according to many reports had stopped buying Russian oil and refining Russian oil, Reliance is back in the business. They're buying Russian oil, and they're just being very careful not to source it directly from Rosneft and Lukoil. So anyway, none of this energy is there. This time, Trump didn't seem to me to be under the same pressure that he had been before from the neocons and the hardliners. So Zelensky came along to Florida with the same package of demands, proposals, unacceptable to the Russians, and demands. He apparently told Trump that there needed to be more pressure on the Russians, more sanctions, more pressure on Russia's shadow fleet, more attempts to squeeze and close down Russia's oil exports. But this time, Trump doesn't seem to have gone along with any of that. He came out of the meeting with Zelensky. There was a brief press conference. Trump basically said that the Ukrainians are going to lose Donbass fairly soon, that the Ukrainians need to make decisions, and that there are many thorny questions still to be resolved. And my overwhelming sense was that Trump this time told Zelensky over the course of this meeting, without any raised voices, without any banging of the fists on the tables or tearing up of maps as there have been apparently before, that Ukraine is running out of road and the United States is not prepared to do much more, and that there is still an attractive deal, or at least maybe not attractive to Zelensky, but there is still a deal on the table, which is the one which the Russians have been proposing, which will allow Ukraine to survive. The Americans are prepared to work with Ukraine and negotiate with the Russians to see whether that deal can be improved. But Zelensky, in Ukraine's interests, needs to accept it. And that, it seems to me, is what came out of the meeting in Florida. And, well, perhaps more than what Trump said, and the very little that Zelensky said over the course of that press conference. He only spoke briefly in response to one question. Perhaps more interesting was the study in the faces. So Trump looked his usual self. Zelensky, I thought, looked exhausted and depressed. Of course, these are always impressions, but that's certainly how it looked to me. He didn't get from the Americans what he was expecting or hoping he would get, the support from the Europeans and the neocons in Washington was less strong. The writing, in effect, is now visible on the wall. And if we go back to Trump, interestingly, on the eve of his meeting with Zelensky, he telephoned Putin. By the way, this is what he also did in October. He telephoned Putin 2 days before meeting with Zelensky in the Oval Office. That was a disastrous call, by the way, between Putin and Trump. It was the call when Trump proposed the summit meeting in Budapest, which never took place. But anyway, this time, literally on the eve of the meeting with Zelensky, Trump called Putin. They had what Putin's aide, Ushakov, says was an extremely friendly, very cordial, very constructive discussion. The Russians were obviously very pleased with the call. Trump agreed with Putin that there needed to be a final settlement of the conflict, that ideas about ceasefires, temporary or otherwise, conditional freezes or unconditional freezes, that really wasn't going to get anywhere. And, well, Putin told Trump about the military situation, told Trump about how the Russians are advancing increasingly rapidly on the battlefronts, and basically said to Trump, Zelensky needs to make some key decisions now, because the situation on the front lines means that unless he does, everything will be played out on the battlefronts very soon indeed. And Trump appeared to agree with him. So Trump clearly is now listening to Putin more than he is to Zelensky. And perhaps the clearest signal of the extent to which Zelensky is out of favor in Washington, not, in my opinion, just by Trump, but by the bigger bureaucracy, is the fact that when Zelensky arrived in Florida, there were no important people to meet him from the American side at the airport. Anyway, that's where we are with the negotiations, but it is the military side of things that is dictating the outcome, and which explains why things in Miami played out in this way. And it is to that which I will now turn. Now, we have had over the last 2 days 2 major conferences between Putin and his generals. One took place on the 27th of December. The other took place today. And the generals, including Gerasimov, who was the main speaker at both of these events, anyway, they provided updates about the military situation, and they have been perhaps the most dramatic updates provided up to now at any point in the war. I do not recall any moment during the war when there have been quite so many dramatic events in different parts of the conflict line, all happening in quick succession to each other, and several of them reported over the course of the same day. So firstly, on the 27th of December, Gerasimov and the generals reported to Putin that the town of Stepnogorsk in Zaporozhye region, located to the south of the city of Zaporozhye itself, had been fully captured by the Russians. That the town of Huliaipole, much bigger place than Stepnogorsk, located on the eastern side of the Zaporozhye front lines, along the Gaitshur River, where the Ukrainians have tried to establish a fortified line, that the city of Huliaipole has been captured by the Russians entirely. That Mirnograd, the eastern suburb of Pokrovsk, which is treated as a standalone town, even though Pokrovsk and Mirnograd make up a single urban conurbation, that Mirnograd has also now been fully captured by the Russians, and that the Ukrainian force in Mirnograd that had been encircled there, that it has collapsed, and that the entire town is now under Russian control. And that north of Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, the town of Rodinska, an important mining town with, I believe, a population of around 10,000 people. So we're not talking about a very small place. It's certainly more than a village. That had been captured too. Now, immediately after those claims, the Ukrainian General Staff issued a statement denying all of them, saying that the Ukrainians still had a presence in Pokrovsk itself, that they still held northern Pokrovsk, that they still had a presence in Mirnograd, and I don't recall them saying much about Rodinska. The problem, and of course I should say that the media in the West basically accepted as true all of the Ukrainian denials. The problem with doing that is that shortly after the generals provided these reports to Putin, in Huliaipole and Mirnograd and Rodinska, the Russian Defense Ministry published videos showing Russian troops in many locations of these three towns raising the Russian flags. And it's difficult to doubt, given the multiple places where these flags were raised, that the Russians are indeed in control, full control, of all three of these towns. I mean, the very act of raising flags and being able to do so in public shows that there is little immediate fighting going on in the particular area where the flag is being raised. And when you see the flags all over the town, flags being simultaneously raised all over the town, it's, to my mind, all but impossible to dispute the evidence that the video footage this time is providing. There's been no similar video footage from Stepnogorsk, but even the Ukrainians admit that the Russians are operating well to the north and east of Stepnogorsk and west of Stepnogorsk as well, in a way that is consistent with the town having fallen. And there's been video footage that the Ukrainians themselves have provided of Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian soldiers in Stepnogorsk, which also appear to confirm that the town has been captured, though perhaps here the Russian positions are a little less secure than they are in the other three places, Huliaipole, Mirnograd and Rodinska. So this cumulatively amounts to a disaster. The entire Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, Rodinska conurbation is now securely under Russian control. The Russians have established very powerful positions to the west of the Slavyansk, Calamitous, Druzhivka, Konstantinovka conurbation. There have been further reports as well that the Russians have made further advances in this area too. That the village of Sofeevka, located to the northwest of Mirnograd Pokrovsk, has now been captured. If there are any Ukrainian troops still in Sharkovo, where previous reports have suggested that the Russians are in control of the village, but which the Russian Defense Ministry has never said that the Russians control. But if there are still Ukrainian troops there, they are now trapped. And there are further reports this morning that the Russians are now returning in force to the area of the August breakthrough, and that they are now in the process of recapturing all of the villages that they briefly held during the August breakthrough. And no doubt we will see them soon in Kucherov Yar and Zoloty Kolodiaz and all of those places again. And there are reports that the Russians are in the process of advancing northwards again towards Dobropilia, major Ukrainian defensive point to the north of Pokrovsk, and also that the Russians will once again begin their pincer movement to try to cut off supplies to the Ukrainian forces that are still holding out in Konstantinovka. Anyway, so a disastrous situation in Donbass reported to Putin by the Russian generals. Disastrous for the Ukrainians, that is. And perhaps an even more disastrous situation for the Ukrainians in Zaporozhye region. The Ukrainian defenses in Huliaipole collapsed rapidly. The Russians needed only, I think, about 3 weeks to capture this town. The Ukrainian defenses along the Gaidshur River have collapsed, and the Ukrainian defenses south of the city of Zaporozhye are also collapsing. And Putin, over the course of the meeting on the 27th of December, said that with Huliaipole under Russian control, the Russians now have now taken the second biggest town in Zaporozhye, Huliaipole, that was still under Ukrainian control, and that leaves only Orekhov left before the Russians come to the city of Zaporozhye itself and, in effect, begin operations to capture Zaporozhye. Now, that was the meeting on the 27th of December, and I will return to it shortly because Putin said some very interesting things over the course of this conference. But then there was the follow-up conference that has taken place today, and this looked at the situation on the other battlefronts. So firstly, there was a discussion of the situation in the Kupiansk-Siversk area. We're told that the Russians are continuing to advance westwards from Siversk, that they're pushing hard towards the city of Slavyansk. The group commander spoke, the West Group of Forces commander said that his forces are now fighting inside Liman, that around half the town is under Russian control, that the supply routes to Liman have been cut, and Putin appeared to feel that Liman is also shortly going to fall under Russian control as well. And there was a discussion about the situation in Kupiansk at the conference today. And both Gerasimov and the Group of Forces West commander said that the Ukrainians are still cut off, they're still surrounded east of the Oskol River, but that the force there has significantly reduced. There were 3,500 men there before. The force is now down to 2,500 men. I wonder what has happened, by the way, to the missing 1,000 men. Who knows? Anyway, and that the size of the territory that the Ukrainians control on the east bank of the Oskol, where they're surrounded, has been reduced by half. And the commander, the Group of Forces West commander, said that he expects this cauldron to have been completely extinguished by some time in January or early February. And there was some discussion about the situation in Kupiansk, and Putin said that all attempts by the Ukrainians to disrupt the situation in Kupiansk must be put an end to, and the commander agreed, and Putin said to him, I know that you've taken all the necessary steps to do that. So, with those casual words, Ukraine's Kupiansk offensive or counteroffensive that we have been hearing so much about was dismissed by the Russian generals. The main fighting continues to be on the east bank of the Oskol River, and the Russians are working to basically sort that out. Group of Forces West is obviously very busy. It has to also fight and defeat the Ukrainians in Liman, and this is clearly a major battle. But again, Putin seemed confident that victory, or at least the capture of that town, is well within sight. And then another Russian general, General Teplinsky, who is the commander of Group of Forces Dnipro. I think I am right in saying that Teplinsky has commanded Group of Forces Dnipro longer than any other Russian general. He is highly regarded by the general staff and by Putin himself, and he is also, I believe, still the commander of Russia's airborne forces. Anyway, Teplinsky, over the course of the conference today, said that the Russians are indeed in complete control of Stepnogorsk, and that they're clearing all the heavy and well-constructed Ukrainian defenses south of Zaporozhye, the city of Zaporozhye, and that their forward units are now within just 15 kilometers of the city of Zaporozhye. 15 kilometers, it should be stressed, does not mean that the Russians are about to attack Zaporozhye city. There is still an awful lot of work to be done before that operation is commenced, but it is now coming within sight. Now, the most interesting thing in some respects about the meeting today is that there was an extensive discussion between Putin and the generals about the situation in Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, and it was quite clear that there is a plan. In fact, the generals mentioned this. There is a plan drawn up by the general staff to capture Zaporozhye and the city of Zaporozhye and Kherson regions too. And Putin gave every indication that that remains the objective and that he expects this objective to be achieved by military means at some point next year. So the city of Zaporozhye is undoubtedly being targeted for capture by the Russian military. And there are clear orders from the political leadership to do that. Today's meeting puts this beyond any possible doubt. Now, there was also reports from the commander of Group of Forces North. He mentioned that Group of Forces North now has positions just 20 kilometers north of the city of Sumy. For the moment, the Russians are only talking about buffer zones in Sumy, Kharkiv, and Dnipropetrovsk regions. By the way, on the subject of Dnipropetrovsk region, Gerasimov said that the Russians now control half of the important fortified village of Novopavlivka, which suggests that it too is likely to fall within the next couple of days. But anyway, the Russians are still talking about buffer zones. But frankly, I think this is code. I think that for the moment, if Zelensky were to come forward and say that he accepts tomorrow that the 4 regions should pass under Russian control and that he's prepared to withdraw Ukrainian troops from the 4 regions, the Russians would agree to pull back from Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkiv and Sumy regions, or at least would insist on only holding temporary buffer zones in those regions. But I don't think anybody in Moscow expects that, and there will come a point when the fiction that these are just buffer zones will drop away, and already we see that the commander of Group of Forces North, General Nikiforov, is saying that his troops are just 20 kilometers from the city of Sumy, which must be an attractive target if the war continues. Now, this is a catalogue of catastrophe. Simply setting it out in this way, as I've just done, I think just does not convey the extent to which Ukrainian frontline positions are breaking down. They're breaking down in Zaporozhye, they're breaking down in Donbass. And Putin made a very sour comment at the end of the meeting on the 27th of December. He said that Russia's interest in a negotiated withdrawal of the Ukrainian troops from Donbass, not from Donbass, from all of these territories, is approaching zero. Now, what Putin meant, and it's not difficult to see from the context, is that the Ukrainians have missed their chance. They had the option when he made his speech to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024 and proposed the terms for settlement, which I've called Istanbul Plus. They had the option of using the fact that they still controlled significant areas of Donbass, Zaporozhye and Kherson regions as bargaining chips in negotiations. They could have come down, talked with the Russians about this, negotiated the terms of their withdrawal, extracted concessions from the Russians in other areas in return for the Russians not having to conduct fighting to capture all of these places. What is now happening is that in Zaporozhye region and in Donbass, Putin and the Russian leadership see the fighting as coming rapidly towards its end. Not only are the Ukrainians now in an impossible geographic position. If we're talking about Donbass, with Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, Rodinska under Russian control, with Dobropilya probably likely to be before long too, with Konstantinovka likely to fall, the Russian commander of forces in the Konstantinovka area said that roughly 40% of Konstantinovka by territory is now indeed under Russian control. So with Konstantinovka likely to be under Russian control, and with the Russians advancing towards Slavyansk from Siversk, from the east, and strengthening their positions in the north, it's only a matter of months before Ukraine either retreats from the cities of Slavyansk and Calamitous, or if it decides to fight for these two cities, it faces the prospect of having its forces surrounded there. So the battle, the long, grinding, difficult battle for Donbass that the Russians have been fighting basically since May 2022 is coming to an end. And the battle for Zaporozhye is coming to an end as well. The Russians have broken Ukrainian defenses in Zaporozhye. It's probably the fall of Orekhov is now only weeks away. Sometime by late winter or early spring, the Russians will have reached the city of Zaporozhye itself. The city of Zaporozhye, city of almost 1 million people at one time, is located on the east bank of the Dnieper River. All supplies to Zaporozhye city come across the bridges. The Russians have shown that they're able to stop traffic on the bridges. Again, any Ukrainian troops who try to defend Zaporozhye city would quickly find themselves surrounded with all the results, with the kind of results that one would expect from that. So the fighting in Zaporozhye and Donbass is coming to an end. That still leaves Kherson. I can't imagine if the Ukrainians, especially if the Ukrainians lose Zaporozhye city, that they would be able to hold out in Kherson for very long either. And for the record, if the Ukrainians also lose the city of Zaporozhye, Ukrainian positions along the Black Sea, in Odessa and Nikolaev, become increasingly untenable for reasons that I will discuss in future programs. Just to say, in the meantime, we have more and more evidence that the Ukrainian army is running down. There are many reports now from the Ukrainian side that resistance in Huliaipole collapsed, that soldiers fled. There are lots of reports of massive desertions now across the Ukrainian army. My own sense is that demoralization is now becoming so strong, not just across Ukrainian society, but within the army itself, that more and more men are no longer prepared to give up their lives for a cause that they are increasingly see is lost. So this is the story of the war. Now, there are many people in the West who still deny this reality. We see this with reports that still appear in the media. I still find it incredible that I read in the media reports about how Zelensky disproved Putin's claims about the Russian capture of Kupiansk by being filmed, by going to Kupiansk himself and by being filmed there. As I pointed out, he wasn't actually filmed in Kupiansk itself at all. And that stunt, as far as I'm concerned, far from confirming his claims, instead undermined them. But I think that Trump and his officials can already increasingly see the true picture. Putin explained it to Trump over the course of their telephone call just before Trump met with Zelensky. And I suspect there's a dawning realization of this increasingly amongst more and more people in Europe as well. Certainly Meloni's comments to the officials of the Italian government seem to suggest that. And Macron's frantic proposals now that he starts some kind of massive dialogue with Putin suggested too. So anyway, that is the reality of the situation, and it explains why Trump basically gave Zelensky his marching orders in the meeting in Miami, why he didn't agree to any of Zelensky's proposals or demands. Because what Trump can see is that what Zelensky was trying to do was to get Trump to recommit to an enterprise, the war in Ukraine, which Ukraine is now visibly and rapidly losing. Now, that then brings us to what actually came out of the meeting in Miami. Firstly, over the course of the conversation, the telephone conversation between Putin and Trump spoke about setting up two working parties, one to discuss security issues, the other to discuss economic issues, and this was intended to focus on the situation, resolving the conflict in Ukraine. And Putin agreed, and the two men, Putin and Trump, agreed that there would be a follow-up call and that steps would be taken to set up these two working parties in January, early in January next year. And Peskov, Putin's spokesman this morning, says that the Russians are expecting this call to take place very soon, this follow-up Putin-Trump call very soon. The trouble is that I suspect that the Russians, who have been insisting on working parties for a long, long time, were probably expecting that these working parties would be made up exclusively of American and Russian negotiators, that we would, in other words, be moving towards a bilateral negotiation between the Americans and the Russians. What has emerged from the meetings in Miami is that the Ukrainians have been told to set up working parties as well. And we know that one of these working parties will be headed by Umerov. I'm not sure who the other person who will head the working parties is going to be. So it looks like a tripartite negotiation. Russian working parties, American working parties, and Ukrainian working parties all negotiating with each other. Well, this would have been a step forward, and it might have worked had it been proposed and set up, say, in May of this year, when Putin first suggested that the Ukrainians and the Russians resume negotiations with each other in Istanbul. We are now in December. Not only are we in December, but we've just seen this catastrophic situation play out on the battlefronts. The Ukrainians have now lost Pokrovsk, the entire Mercouris conurbation. Their defences in Donbass are collapsing, and collapsing rapidly. Their defences in Zaporozhye are collapsing and collapsing rapidly. The Russian army is 15 kilometers from Zaporozhye city and 20 kilometers from Sumy. And the Russians continue to pound Ukraine every night from the skies, in the sky. The Ukrainian Air Force is now basically an irrelevance. Ukraine's air defenses seem to have functionally stopped working. And, well, every day we get reports about electrical power cut-offs, blackouts in Ukrainian cities. The situation is going from bad to worse. And over the course of this month also, we have had the situation of the Europeans unable to come up with the funding that the Ukrainians were expecting. Truly, for the Ukrainians, this has been a dark, if you like, even black December. A month of catastrophe. Setting up negotiations now of the kind that was discussed in Miami, with three working parties, or rather two working parties, with three different delegations participating in these working parties. I mean, this is going to take weeks or months if it is going to be conducted properly. And Trump himself said that he has no deadline for achieving the negotiated resolution. Does Ukraine have weeks and months? What happens when the Russians reach Zaporozhye city? What happens when they start attacking Calamitous and Slavyansk? What happens in all of these places? One can see how the negotiation process is going to be very rapidly overtaken by the rapidly changing situation on the battlefronts. It's almost inconceivable now that the negotiations are going to be able to keep up with events on the ground. And this is what comes when you spend months denying reality, pretending that you've fought the other side to a stalemate, pretending that in fact you're actually winning the war, and the side that's clearly winning the war is losing it. And, well, you find yourself in the situation that you are now in. Some Ukrainians get this. Kirill Budanov, Ukraine's military intelligence chief, who began the war as an extreme hardliner and basically somebody who was against all compromise, but who over the course of the last 2 years has become more and more pessimistic in his assessments. Anyway, he's now given in public an extraordinary interview in which he basically says that Ukraine is losing, that there's no attempt, he makes no real attempt to deny that fact. He said that Ukraine needs peace, and that it is fantastic for Ukraine to believe that any peace that it negotiates with Russia, the far stronger side, can be on anything other than Russian terms. So there are some Ukrainians who get this. I doubt that Zelensky himself ever will. He is far too committed to holding out to the bitter end. He still, I suspect, imagines that somehow his cunning strategies to get the Americans involved and the Europeans involved are going to succeed. If they fail, I still believe that his priority is to keep at least some money flowing to Ukraine from the West, so that he can eventually decamp with his suitcases filled and establish his government in exile in Nice or Biarritz or foggy London, or perhaps, who knows, even Miami. I still believe that is his plan. I suspect that most of the political class in Kiev is in agreement with him about this. But I wonder whether that same political class are going to say to themselves, well, look, Zelensky has failed. He's not got the Americans involved. He's not got the Europeans coming up with the money we need. Things are falling apart fast. The front lines are crumbling. The money is starting to run out. let's push him aside so that we can get quicker, closer to the money flows, so that we can fill up our suitcases before the end point comes. And, well, there's every sign now, and I suspect Zelensky knows it, that the political crisis in Kiev is going to resume with a vengeance. There's talk that the various anti-corruption investigators are going to come after members of Zelensky's parliamentary faction. And there's also reports that General Zelensky, Zelensky's rival, who has been in a kind of exile in London as Ukraine's ambassador, is now returning to Kiev, that he's going to give up his ambassadorship. And it's difficult to see such a move, if that is indeed what Zelensky is planning, as intended as anything other than some kind of plot against Zelensky himself. And if I have to be frank, I think that Budanov's words, his interview, ultimately is also intended to undermine Zelensky too. So I suspect that the knives are going to be out for Zelensky over the next few months. I think his position will now crumble, even as the front lines crumble. But certainly, I have no expectation at all of the negotiations themselves going anywhere. Now, we are, I think, now at the tipping point, the final tipping point of this war. There is nothing that can stop the Russian army. If Donbass, the defenses of Donbass and Zaporozhye break down, with the Ukrainian army itself crumbling, the Russians will be in a position where they can effectively dictate whatever outcome they choose on the battlefronts. The political situation in Kiev is deteriorating, and the money flows from the West are drying up. We are not yet at the end, but I don't think anybody looking at this situation objectively would doubt that in 2026 the end will come. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X, and also Substack. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.